Happy Saturday, everybody. Welcome to another episode of China Update, where we discuss leading political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. It's been a bit of a busy week. It's the weekend now. I hope you folks are all enjoying it. Thank you for coming for this extra episode over the weekend. I will try to keep it light, but there are some important developments we need to cover so that we're on top of everything before we move into what will likely be another busy week next week. As always, I deeply appreciate you all coming along on this journey while we try to follow this complex country, China, every day. Let's jump in. And first up, after 8 months of steady growth, China's export engine spluttered in October, marking its first year-on-year decline since February. The value of exports slipped 1.1% according to data from China's General Administration of Customs published yesterday, Friday, defying economists' expectations for continued expansion. The setback highlights growing headwinds facing Chinese manufacturers as global prices for major exports such as electric vehicles, solar panels, and batteries continue to fall. While export volumes remain strong, Chinese companies have been slashing prices to offload surplus output, driving a disconnect between physical shipments and export volumes. Despite mounting trade tensions and new tariffs from countries including the United States, Brazil, India, and Turkey, China is still on track to post another record trade surplus this year. Exports to the EU, Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia all weakened in October, reflecting a shift toward high-tech products, especially cars and solar panels, that have been hit by steep price declines. These are also the very sectors that have seen the most intense form of overcapacity within China. Now, even so, the number of cars shipped abroad surged nearly 25% from a year earlier, though their total value rose only 17%. Once again, a result of this overcapacity and the intense price competition it has sparked domestically. This year, we have seen over and over again exports going up, but profit margins collapsing. Analysts also note that the same exporters may be rerouting goods through countries like Vietnam to sidestep US tariffs, an issue called transshipping, which Washington has been trying to combat, an area we will unpack more on Monday's episode. Domestically, a sluggish property market and cautious consumer spending continue to depress demand, pushing manufacturers to rely on foreign buyers. And on this theme, next up, this week the United States and China have been moving to implement the trade and tariff adjustments agreed upon last week, signaling a cautious detente amid their ongoing strategic competition. China's finance ministry confirmed Wednesday that it will lift tariffs imposed on the 4th of March this year on key US agricultural products including soybeans, corn, wheat, sorghum, and chicken, effective the 10th of November, this coming Monday. This rollback, previously outlined in a White House fact sheet last week, marks a notable step toward easing bilateral trade frictions. Simultaneously, China's Commerce Ministry announced it would remove 15 American firms from its export control list and delist 10 others from the unreliable entity list. The ministry also lifted restrictions on Illumina Inc.'s DNA sequencing exports to China, a move expected to benefit US biotech exporters. On the US side, President Trump signed executive orders reducing fentanyl-related tariffs on Chinese exports and extending a suspension of planned reciprocal tariff hikes earlier this week. In parallel, state-run Xinhua reported that China will continue to suspend the 24% additional tariff on US imports for another year, while retaining a 10% baseline rate. The Customs Tariff Commission of the State Council stated that the policy adjustment effective the 10th of November this year implements the, quote, outcomes and consensus reached in recent China-US economic talks, end quote. Despite this temporary easing, analysts, including myself, note that the broader strategic rivalry remains unchanged. As the Asia Society observed this week, the recent fourth plenum in Beijing reaffirmed General Secretary Xi Jinping's emphasis on technological self-reliance and state-led industrial policy, signaling that while both sides seek temporary stability, structural competition continues to define the US-China relationship. One of these areas, of course, is rare earths, where the US-led West will be racing to diversify away from China. We'll be covering this next, but let's end this part on the US-China trade war with this observation this week, yesterday actually, by veteran China analyst Bill Bishop. Quote, Taiwan is still a red line in US-China relations too. In a video speech to the US-China Business Council Conference, PRC Ambassador to the US, Xie Feng, reminded the audience that Taiwan, democracy and human rights, path and system, and development rights are China's 4 red lines. He expressed the hope that the US side will avoid crossing them and causing trouble. The absence of any mention of Taiwan in the readouts from the Xi-Trump meeting last week was noteworthy, but there is no change in the importance of Taiwan in the bilateral relationship. I do hope that the US-China Business Council Conference leadership is advising its members to make good use of this tactical pause in US-China tensions to diversify their operations as much as possible. End quote. And on this theme, this brings us to the next development. The global contest for control over rare earths and critical minerals underpinning electric vehicles, renewable energy and advanced defence systems is accelerating rapidly. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told the UK-based Financial Times this week that China's long-standing dominance in rare earths is nearing an end, predicting that Beijing's leverage over the United States, quote, would last no more than 12 to 24 months, end quote. Speaking after the Trump-Xi meeting in South Korea, Bessent said the two leaders had reached a fragile equilibrium, but argued that China had overplayed its hand by weaponizing critical minerals. Quote, it's one thing to put the gun on the table, end quote, he warned. Quote, it's another thing to fire shots in the air, end quote. Beijing's decision earlier this year to impose new export restrictions on rare earth technologies, essential for high-performance magnets and semiconductors, sparked a wave of countermeasures among major economies. Although China recently suspended an expansion of those curbs, the European Union remains wary. At a Brussels press conference this week, European Commission spokesperson Olaf Gill confirmed that the suspension, quote, applies to the entire world, end quote, but said that talks with Beijing continue, quote, to understand the precise modalities, end quote. When pressed on whether the April restrictions themselves remain in effect, he responded, quote, precisely, end quote. The ambiguity is part of Europe's frustration at being left out of China's easing and its vulnerability in a market still 70% controlled by Chinese refiners. Meanwhile, other nations are accelerating efforts to secure their own supplies. India is preparing to nearly triple funding for domestic rare earth magnet manufacturing from $290 million to about $788 million US as part of its strategy to reduce reliance on Chinese imports. The expanded program, awaiting cabinet approval, would strengthen India's capacity to supply materials for electric vehicles, wind turbines and defence applications. Canada too has entered the fray with a 6.4 billion Canadian dollar, 4.6 billion US dollar critical minerals initiative announced this week. We covered this as well as the wider budget in more detail on my other channel market update earlier this week. Ottawa unveiled 25 new investments and off-take agreements designed to solidify partnerships with G7 allies. The Trade Minister said Canada would invoke its Defence Production Act to create a national stockpile of critical minerals, echoing similar US moves under national security authorities. Quote, this enables Canada to launch our own defence stockpiling regime, end quote, he said, adding, quote, and to support multilateral stockpiling efforts, end quote. As governments rush to secure alternative supply chains, one thing is clear. China's rare earth dominance has triggered the very diversification drive that may ultimately undo it. The question is, will the US-led West complete this shift before China chooses to employ that leverage once again? Next up, we have one more development to cover, but just quickly, as always, guys, it's a huge help if you just hit that like button, if you're getting some value from today's episode. The algorithm has not been particularly happy with China Update these last couple of months. I do not know why. All I can do is to continue producing this content the best I can every day and hope that you all get some value from it, and hopefully YouTube will change its mind in the coming months. But in the meantime, it's still always a pleasure to make these for you guys every day. As always, a favor is just to like and share, and if you haven't already, subscribing is also a big help. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links also in the description for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. But however you support the channel, whether it's just listening, whenever you have time, I very much appreciate it. So thank you. Now, let's move to the last development, which is on the Chinese economy. Chinese Premier Li Qiang struck an upbeat tone on the nation's economic trajectory this week, suggesting that China's economy will maintain a steady growth pace over the next 5 years, even amid growing uncertainty. Speaking at the 8th China International Import Expo, CIIE in Shanghai, Li projected that China's gross domestic product will exceed 170 trillion yuan, about $23.9 trillion US by 2030, an outlook that implies an average nominal growth rate of roughly 4% a year. Quote, "This increase represents new significant contributions to global growth," end quote, Li told delegates from government and business. He pledged that China would focus on, quote, "expanding domestic demand, especially on boosting consumption," end quote, positioning household spending as the main engine for the next stage of development. Economists said the figure should be seen as a growth floor rather than a formal target. Michelle Lam, Greater China economist at Societe Generale, noted that, quote, "nominal GDP growth won't go further down from here onwards," end quote, adding that escalating deflation has become more urgent than chasing higher real growth. ANZ Bank strategist Zhao Pengxing estimated that a GDP of 170 to 180 trillion yuan would represent a reasonable annual nominal growth range of 4 to 5%. While China is on track to meet its 5% real GDP growth target this year, nominal expansion has been tempered by falling prices, a deflationary trend that threatens consumption and profitability. Beijing has rolled out sweeping so-called anti-involution campaigns aimed at curbing destructive price wars in industries such as electric vehicles and food delivery. The policy is intended to help companies restore pricing power, support wages, and stimulate consumer confidence. Of course, regular viewers of China Update know that if Beijing says it will hit these growth targets, then it will. The question is not of how, but rather at what cost. For over a decade now, growth rates have been achieved at the cost of 1. Massive overcapacity, the property sector being the most obvious but not the only example of this; 2. A heavily burdened household sector resulting in chronically weak consumption; and 3. Surging debt levels, worse than any advanced economy at similar levels of development. Keeping growth artificially high will only exacerbate these structural crises. They also used the CIIE platform to criticize global trade barriers, arguing that, quote, "unilateral and protectionist measures have had a severe impact on the international economic and trade order," end quote. Of course, he didn't mention China's massive industrial policy and the effect this has on the global trade order. Against this backdrop, Beijing has signaled that its next 5-year plan, beginning in 2026, will emphasize consumption-led growth, stronger social spending, and employment promotion. The direction aligns with long-term goals outlined at the Communist Party's so-called questions and answers on implementing the recommendations of the 4th plenary session, which projects an average annual GDP growth rate of 4.17% through 2035, enough to double per capita income and lift China to the ranks of what analysts in Beijing call a moderately developed nation. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Like I said, I hope you have enjoyed this week's updates. I hope you can now enjoy your weekend, have a restful weekend, and I hope to see you all for a new week of developments on Monday.